The idea of scaling in biology refers to how a biological system responds to changes in its overall size. More specifically, the properties that characterize animals, such as their metabolic rate, heart rate, and average lifespan, are systematically related to the size of the animal. But how, in a precise quantitative sense, does that kind of biological scaling manifest? In this episode of the Thinking Tools podcast, I speak with Dr. Geoffrey West about these and other ideas from his 2017 book, Scale: The Universal Laws of Growth, Innovation, Sustainability, and the Pace of Life in Organisms, Cities, Economies, and Companies. Geoffrey West is a distinguished professor and former president of the Santa Fe Institute and an associate senior fellow of Oxford's University Green-Templeton College. He obtained his BA from Cambridge in 1961 and PhD from Stanford in 1966, where he was later on the faculty. For many years, he ran high-energy physics at Los Alamos National Laboratory. He is a theoretical physicist whose primary interests have been in fundamental questions ranging across physics, biology, and the social sciences. His work is motivated by the search for unifying principles and simplicity underlying complexity. His research includes metabolism, growth, aging and death, sleep, cancer, ecosystems, rates of growth and innovation, and the accelerating pace of life. More recently, he's been developing a science of cities and companies, including the challenge of long-term global sustainability. He's lectured worldwide at many high-profile events, including Davos and TED. He has received many awards, and his work is featured in numerous publications, podcasts, and TV productions, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Economist, Le Monde and Scientific American, and he's participated in television productions including Nova, National Geographic, and the BBC. His work was selected as a breakthrough idea by the Harvard Business Review in 2006, and in 2007 he was on Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people in the world. By the way, if you're new to this channel, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to sign up for our weekly video newsletter. The link is in the caption, or you can go to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter. Now, without further ado, my conversation with Dr. Geoffrey West. All right. So I will have read your full bio for the audience before we're actually talking here. But would you mind just giving a little bit of your background and why you decided to study physics and how you made the turn into fundamental questions in biology?
Oh, yes. So that's actually a long story, and I'll try to keep it short. But I guess I've always been, like most kids, I was always very inquisitive and interested in big picture things and so on. And I came from, a mildly religious background, from my early years, like most young kids who were brought up in that way, that was where the answers were until I was exposed to, probably even by the age of 10 or 11, 12, those years, to mathematics. And I recognized the power of mathematics. I must have had good teachers, because suddenly there was a dim concept that this was not just predictive, but it gave exact answers, in quotes, exact. And that changed things for me in some subtle way, I think. And I was good at mathematics. So, my education took a sort of, mathematical physics kind of bent to it all the way through, and through high school. That was the thing I mostly concentrated on. And but I was also, at the same time, I was not interested in the biological sciences, mostly because, especially in high school, I'm talking about the 50s, it was taught stamp collecting or whatever, just, one damn fact after another kind of thing. And it didn't seem to have any real logic to it. And it was, it was nice. It was nature. That was nice. But it didn't have any deep explanation and so forth. So I wasn't much interested in things outside of this, but I was very taken by the humanities. So my life up through my student years had these two threads that seemed superficially to be at odds with one another. One sort of the hard sciences, and the other was kind of whatever spiritual life had been instilled in me in my religious upbringing got transferred into being intrigued by literature and art. And I say that because I think that stayed with me all the way through my professional life as a professional physicist, theoretical physicist in later years. And it stayed enough to bring me back to this bigger picture that got me interested in now biological questions. But going back to that, I was an undergraduate in first in mathematics, and then I switched to physics. And I was an undergraduate at Cambridge in England. And then when I graduated, I decided that actually physics was not really for me, even though because it was wonderful because of it had this precision to it and this powerful predictive nature and this sense that it could deal with almost any problem. That was good on the one hand. On the other, I didn't think I was smart enough to do it. And secondly, I think at some intuitive level, it lacked a spiritual quality. And so I decided I had become intrigued by California. I'm talking about 1960, 61. And I had grown up in post-war Britain, which was dour, to put it mildly, as I look back on it especially. And I had met some Californians, and they, to me, appeared like they'd come from Mars. So I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend a year in California and decide what I'm going to do. But while I'm there, I'm going to write my great novel.
Wow.
So the only way, I come from a very modest, was poor background. So the only way I could get to California was a ruse in which I applied to graduate school in physics, and they would support me. And so I went to Stanford as a graduate student, not telling them that I was only going to stay a year. And I went and with this idea of writing a novel, believe it or not, which never happened, of course. But what did happen, which shocked me, was that I got excited by physics again, and the whole idea of physics. And that was less to do with the physics department at Stanford, which was a great department, but more to do with my fellow graduate students, who were just a very exciting, interesting bunch. And just the kind of collegial conversations that took place inspired me. And I got very turned on to physics. And so I reoriented my career sort of unconsciously towards doing physics, theoretical physics, I should say. And I did not go back to England, which I intended to. And I sort of gradually, maybe out of lethargy and having to make a decision, just stayed on and finished my doctorate. And my thesis wasn't terribly exciting, frankly, but I then started on a classic academic career. I went to Cornell and then to Harvard, and then they wanted me back at Stanford, so I went back on the faculty at Stanford. And so I started my career dealing with questions in fundamental physics. I mean, that is what's used to be called elementary particle physics, sometimes called high energy physics, because of the building of the very large accelerators to do the experiments to examine very small distances. So that that started my career doing that, searching for the fundamental laws of nature, quarks and gluons, and ultimately string theory and dark matter and Higgs particles and origins of the universe, all these marvelous questions, wonderful, wonderful science, but extremely hard, extremely difficult. I mean, both conceptually, but less so conceptually than it was technically. technically extremely difficult. But so to cut a long story short, in the 90s, some of your audience may recall that the US was proposing to build this superconducting supercollider in Texas, which was going to be this mammoth particle accelerator to investigate some of these problems. And I was engaged in that a little bit anyway, and but it was canned in the mid-90s. And at the same time, sort of concomitant with that, there was one of these bouts that rises in the US in particular, a kind of anti-science kind of rhetoric that started to appear more and more. And it got focused to some extent in sort of anti-physics, and in particular the superconducting supercollider, both within the scientific community, even within the physics community, and then politically. And in the mid-90s, after spending $3 billion, the superconducting supercollider, the so-called SSC, was canned. And but the important thing in terms of this story is that not only, of course, was that very depressing for those of us that this was our field, was that the kind of comment that was being made, it was a classic comment, was that physics was the science of the 19th and 20th centuries, and biology would be the science of the 21st century. And as a theoretical physicist, I would say, I'd screw up my face and say, they must be kidding, kind of. Actually not, because how I did react was, as I thought about it, was, yes, it's clear that biology is going to burst, it's going to just come into its own in the 21st century. That's very clear. All the huge, interesting questions and the wonderful things that are being discovered and blah, blah, blah. That was very clear. However, then I made the following. I should have added one thing. This statement about biology being the science of the 21st century, often as a corollary, but rarely actually written, was, therefore, there's no need to do any more physics. We don't more fundamental. We know all the physics we need to know. Why do we need, we know it all, so to speak. My reaction to the biology thing was, yes, it will be the science of the 21st century, but it won't become a real science in the sense that I understand science until it embraces some of the conceptual framework and paradigm and techniques and way of thinking of physics, which has been the most successful of all sciences. We wouldn't be talking to one another this way without, science even of the 19th century. So it's been kind of extraordinary. The world we live in is dominated by the extraordinary success of the physical sciences, and in particular physics. And, maybe we'll have similar revolutionary kinds of things in the 21st century in biology, some of which we've already seen. But it wouldn't become a real science, meaning, what did I mean by that? I meant quantitative, analytic, mathematizable, computable, predictable. So that was my, naive friend. I knew no biology. It was arrogant. It was, chutzpah in the extreme. But I was very angry, like many of my colleagues. But so I started to think about that a bit, because here was that we were left high and dry without the SSC. And I started thinking, maybe I should put money where my mouth is, instead of just bullshitting away and decrying what biology should be. Maybe I should try to do something. I know biology. So that coincided with something else in my life, and that is that I was already in my mid-50s, and I happened to come from a family, an extended family of short-lived males. Almost all my male relatives die in their 50s or 60s. Occasionally one reaches, there have been some that made 70, but almost all of them die young. My father died at 61, his father at 57, and so on. And here I am in my mid-50s, moving into my late 50s, and I began to realize that, if there is anything to genetics, I don't have much longer, 5 to 10 years max. And that was sort of interesting. And then so I thought, why is that? Why should that be? And in fact, more generally, why is it we die? What is this aging process? Because it wasn't just that I was going to die, but the obvious thing was, my body had changed and was changing, couldn't do the things I used to be able to do, blah, blah, blah. And why is that? What's going on? So I thought that's an interesting question, a personal question. And then I thought, well, so what is the mechanism that leads to aging? And in particular, what sets the scale of 100 years? Why is it that there hasn't been a human being that's lived for 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years? Methuselah is mythical, presumably. So I thought that's an interesting problem. So I went to the library and I started studying all the books, looking at all the papers and the books on aging and death and mortality and so on. Actually, the first thing I did, I have to say, was my kids were in high school and they had these big fat books that you're probably familiar with, biology, which tells you everything about biology.
Yes.
My son was already in college and he had an undergraduate book he'd taken, a general course in biology at the first year. So these books were around. And I thought, oh, great, let me see what they say. I looked at these books, doesn't even mention it. There's not a word. Excuse me, my allergies are bad. That doesn't even mention aging or mortality anywhere. I thought, this is pretty weird. This is presumably the most important event in an organism's life is their birth. But the second most important is their death. And it's not even mentioned. This is supposed to be a subject of biology. It's not all about reproduction and genes and, all the rest of that stuff, ontogeny, and so on. And some about neurobiology and about genomics and all these marvelous things. But, something that has dominated human life since consciousness, the knowledge, we are the only species that knows we're going to die. And it's a biological fact. Why isn't it, it should be more, there should be several chapters in this book. It's not even mentioned. So I thought, that's interesting. So that got me to the libraries. And I found at that time, this is the 90s, that this whole area was a backwater of biology, that there was, yes, of course, there were people working on it, but most people working on it, it came as a secondary thing. I mean, there were obviously dedicated people, but even more surprising to me was that there wasn't a well-developed theory, and even more surprising, nowhere in the entire literature did anybody mention 100 years. And I thought, wow, that does illustrate the difference between physics and biology. The first thing a physicist thinks of is what is the size, what are the scales of the system, what is it? And what is the rate at which you age? Well, there was a little bit about that. So I thought, this is interesting. This is a good problem to work on because it seems like this has been neglected. And so when I sat down to think about it, I thought, well, okay, how would I think about it? Okay, so here's a system that functions extraordinarily well, and then it gradually degrades, and then it falls apart, like my car. Mm-hmm. So obviously, in order to understand death and aging, you have to understand what's keeping the system alive, and then once you've understood what's keeping it alive, you can figure out what's gone wrong, and therefore what's death. So that was the plan. So what keeps it alive? Well, in my reading, I discovered there was metabolism. That's what keeps you alive. You eat, you metabolize, respiratory metabolism, and so on. So I studied all that. And then in that, I'd already sort of knew this a little bit. I discovered these extraordinary scaling laws, particularly about metabolism. And there I found it, Kleiber's law, the famous Kleiber's law. And when I discovered that, I thought, this is it. So obviously, this is the way in, but this is obviously what people have obviously understood, and there must be a whole theory here. And so for your audience that may not know it, because I have learned, surprisingly, many biologists have never heard of it and didn't know it.
I hadn't heard of it before reading your book.
And yet it's foundational to all of life.
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of amazing. As far as I'm concerned, it's as foundational as genomics. Namely, something extraordinary, that if you look at here's metabolism, the most complex, diverse phenomenon in the universe, probably, as far as we know, that is transferring stuff, just the stuff of physics, into life. That's what metabolism, that's an amazing process, amazing biochemical process. And if you ask, how does that scale with the size of the organism? Well, you would have naively thought, since we all believe in natural selection, that, each organism has its own unique history. Everything is historically contingent. Not only just the organism, but every subsystem, every organ, every cell type, every genome within has its own unique history. And so, if you ask, how does something like metabolism vary across sizes of different organisms, you would expect, there might be some regularity, but there would be huge spread of the data reflecting the historical contingency of what made a mouse, and what made an elephant, and so on. But if you look at the data, which a man named Max Kleiber had put together in about 1932, you discover quite the contrary. If you plot it on a graph, they fall on the same line. They all follow a very simple mathematical law, which has become known as Kleiber's law. And he plotted it very sensibly on a logarithmic scale, because if you want to get a mouse and an elephant on the same piece of paper, and you do it linearly, you probably have to go, I think I talked in my book a little, I think you have to go several kilometers piece of paper to put it on. So you do it logarithmically, meaning you got by factors of 10. 1 gram, 10 grams, and so on, 100 grams, and so forth. Then you get a mouse and elephant on the same gram. And when he plotted it that way, they line up on a straight line, which was sort of amazing.
Just for the audience, what were the axes on that graph?
Oh, I'm very sorry. Yes, thank you. So when you plot metabolic rate on the vertical axis, logarithmically, against the mass on the horizontal axis, plotted logarithmically, that is both going up by factors of 10, then you get a nice straight line. And what he discovered was that straight line, not only is it a straight line, which is sort of antithetical to your naive idea about natural selection, it has a very simple slope. That number is 3/4, very close to the number 3/4. And that's kind of amazing. And just to go on from that, since then, it's been discovered very quickly afterwards that for any taxonomic group, this is true. So if you look at mammals, birds, fish, crustacea, whatever, and we did this ourselves down at the cellular level. Look at cell. This was already done by a man named Hemmingson in the 1950s, 1960 maybe. But if you look across cellular, look at different cells of different sizes, they all follow this 3/4. It's the most remarkable scaling law. It goes over something like 27 orders of magnitude, which is absolutely astonishing, the 3/4. It's not continuous, obviously, because life isn't continuous. But if you just plot these various things at these various scales, they're all 3/4, and it's across all taxonomic groups. It's what, in physics, we use the word universal to describe something like that. So, but even more amazing, later discovered, if you look at any physiological variable, that is, it can be as mundane as the heart rate and as sophisticated as genome length, and but any physiological variable that you can think of, rates of diffusion of oxygen across various membranes, lifespans, and so on. So life history events, number of offspring, anything, and you plot them this way, they all look the same thing. They all have these sort of straight lines. I mean, some have a little more variance around them than others, but they're extraordinarily impressive in terms of how much they conform to this simple straight line, especially when when we believe that they've all evolved by this weird sort of random, sort of capricious process of natural selection. So underlying natural selection is this unbelievable regularity that these people had exposed, and a lot of people had exposed them. And indeed, during that period in the 30s and 40s, many of the leading biologists like Huxley and so on got very interested obviously in this. They saw this as a fascinating question as to when the hell does this come from? Haldane, all these kinds of people, these big names in traditional biology had become fascinated by this. And then the war intervened, and then post-war, of course, we had the molecular revolution and the discovery of the structure of DNA, and that completely changed the focus. So these laws, so to speak, I call them laws, these observations, went onto the back burner, way on the back burner, and they remained only cognizant in the ecological community, because ecologists, of course, were interested in diverse systems and so on. So many ecologists were aware of them, but there was no fundamental theory. There are bits and pieces here and there, but no theory. So going back to my own journey in this, I had gone from thinking about aging and mortality to recognizing that you first got to understand metabolism and then ask yourself what's gone wrong with metabolism, so to speak, that's causing this. And so one of the things that I wanted to do first was to understand. I thought, well, obviously, if I'm going to understand what's wrong, I got to better understand this scaling law. So I thought the first thing I'll work out is what is the explanation for this scaling law? I ought to better derive these scaling laws from some fundamental principles. That's what we do in physics.
Yeah.
So I sat down and I thought, what is it? How could it be that a tree, I didn't say this, it's also true of the plant world, which is completely different. So how can it be with systems that have engineering structures that have evolved to be so different as a plant is from, a mammal? How in the hell can they satisfy the same scaling laws? What the hell's going on here? And I thought, well, after thinking about it, I thought, oh, it's obvious. It's that all of these systems are highly complex. They contain an enormous number of agents, namely cells in particular, a huge number. And the real challenge of life is how to support and sustain all of those, in our case, 10 to the 13th customers in a kind of, roughly speaking, efficient democratic way. Well, we know how we've done it. Well, natural selection did it, is that it involved networks. The networks that support them, the obvious ones are the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the renal system, our brains, our bones. They're all networks, and for good reason, because they have to go, you have to have something macroscopic, food, for example, oxygen, and you have to distribute it down to something highly microscopic. And the only way to do that, the obvious way to do it, is you form networks that are hierarchical and they continually branch till you get to the terminal unit. And so I had this idea that it must be the mathematics and physics and the kind of generic properties of these networks that transcend the design that are at work. And so that was the idea. And again, to cut it, so I started working that out. And the idea was that I would work that out, and I did. I worked that out, and then I would ask what goes wrong, and I knew immediately what was going wrong, because in physics we deal with systems like this, and those systems are what we call dissipative systems, because you can't have a system running that doesn't produce wear and tear. It wears things out. It produces entropy. And the most fundamental law in the universe that transcends all laws is the second law of thermodynamics. That is, within a closed system, if you want to create order and keep order, then you must create disorder at the same time, and that's entropy. And so what do? I mean, we only eat in order to sustain ourselves. I mean, well, except during ontogeny, of course, and I can talk about that in a minute. But and so the idea was that, from my perspective, that the reason aging occurs is that, and death ultimately, is that you have this system that's distributing energy and information to all parts of the organism, but it's creating damage. It's wearing and tearing. And if I have a theory, I can calculate that. That was the idea. Now, and and eventually, and of course you repair yourself, you have repair mechanisms, but it must be, as with your automobile, that eventually it doesn't become cost effective to continually take your car. The first couple of years, you don't have much problems. 5 years, you start to have some problems with your car, I'm talking about. And then eventually, it's driving you nuts. This goes and that goes. And eventually you sell it, or you take it to the junkyard and you buy a new one. Well, that was the idea of what biology has done. I'm going to wear out soon. I especially, I'm over 80, so I'm near the very end. And, and my grandchildren, someone went to the store and bought some grandchildren, and they're going to take off from me. They're the new version of this model, so to speak. So that was the idea. And by the way, I think that's, now that I've actually worked on it, and I've worked in biology for getting on for 20 years, I think that's right, what I say, by the way. So that was the idea, and I worked out started work on the network, and I did some things that were right and some things were wrong. But during that period, and this was all, by the way, as a hobby, because I was still running a big high-energy physics group at Los Alamos, and we were involved in major projects. So this was secondary to me, and it was just sort of fun to do. But I was introduced to a phenomenal biologist named James Brown, who was an ecologist. He was actually president of the American Ecological Society of America at that time, who had become associated with the Santa Fe Institute. And I was living in Santa Fe because I worked there, and I was running this large group at Los Alamos. And I was introduced to him because he was very interested in this problem himself and become intrigued by it. And we were brought together, and that changed my life, because it was a fantastic collaboration, because I knew no biology. I was just reading up stuff, and I got various things wrong, the various things I didn't understand. And it was a great collaboration. And he's a wonderful pedagogue, and he knows everything. He's very intuitive. His mathematics is not very sophisticated. And that was very good, because it meant that I had to explain everything in very simple terms and bring it down to the basics. And that was very important in our development. Anyway, we took off from what I had done in terms of these networks and made it into a serious theory, and on metabolism, on these scaling laws. And so that was great. And that paper was published in '97 in Science. And it was, and it created fuss. It got tremendously positive feedback, and it got a lot of shit, of course.
Yeah.
As is inevitable. And one of the things I learned about biology, it's too bad I didn't know more about the biological community when because I wrote most of that paper, because a lot of it was technical. But it was too bad that I didn't appreciate, that most biologists are not. Well, I sort of knew that because I taught biologists at Stanford, but I didn't realize that not just that they were not very well versed in mathematics, which is fine, but they had this schizophrenic attitude towards theory and mathematics. On the one hand, there's this classic sort of physics envy that people talk about, but the other was great resentment. And this can't be, that's not the way. In fact, I have to tell you, I've had at least 2 referee reports of papers that have over 1,000 citations in Nature now, 2 referee reports that say mathematics has no place in biology. That's what the referee report said. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And I don't think this paper should be published. In fact, one even said, I don't think this paper should be published anywhere.
Wow. That is hard to believe.
It is hard to believe. And by the way, one of those, at the other end of the spectrum of those referee reports, it said this paper should get the Nobel Prize. So you can believe that this is
nice. Yes.
So I realized I'm in a sort of loony bin here, and so it's not surprising. It's had, it's got an enormous number of citations, and many people, it's been embraced by many people, but it's also, been attacked in many ways.
Right.
But many, as far as I'm concerned, this is the explanation, and it's And the great thing about it, by the way, is we took that theory. I said once you have a theory, you can derive all kinds of things. So we derive growth, we derive sleep. We understood growth. All kinds of papers have followed from this, and all the other scaling laws, 50 scaling laws, can derive from it. And the attacks on the paper were all about metabolic rate, and not recognizing that if you have a theory that explains not just metabolic rate, but explains all these other things, like, the scaling of the length of the aorta, or whatever, or, the blood flow rate in a capillary. The theory explains a myriad other things, and it's extremely parsimonious because it relies only in quotes, primarily, maybe I should say, on some very generic properties of these networks.
Yeah.
So it's a very, so from my viewpoint, and I think from a traditional philosophy of science viewpoint, that if you can explain, hundreds of results with, a very small number of assumptions, that's pretty powerful. It means that something's right. Now, one of the things you learn in physics that I've been surprised in biology, and also I've worked a lot in the social sciences, social institutions, cities, companies, is that we're very good in physics at something called toy models. Most people don't recognize that the physics that has been successful was derived from models that people knew a priori were wrong. And the classic that people may be familiar with is something like the Rutherford atom, or what we call the Bohr atom. The idea that you have a nucleus and these electrons are going around like the solar system, the idea of the solar system. That was obviously wrong. We knew that was right. Can't be, because if you have an electron that's going around in circles, it has to radiate, and then it collapses into the middle. So the whole system collapses in a nanosecond. So it was obviously wrong a priori. But doesn't matter. We'll take it and see. It predicted so many things. And from that, we have quantum mechanics, and you and I are talking over a couple of thousand miles or wherever you are, and it's extraordinary. And somehow I've learned that biology doesn't like to work that way. It's sort of like, and it's a shame, because if it's going to be the science of the 21st century, it better start doing that, is my advice, such as it is. And so I consider this model way beyond the Bohr atom because it's quite specific. It has very specific predictions, and it's been very successful. And so part of the problem here is a kind of cultural philosophical issue that comes up, which is very interesting, I think, of itself.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a recurring problem in biology. Although I think things like computational neuroscience and network neuroscience is starting to seemingly edge into the mathematical areas. But I want to back up a little bit and talk about some of the ideas you introduced, and that was just a great overview of a lot of the questions I want to ask you, and we can kind of get into these now. So you mentioned we were talking a lot about biological networks, and you described how they have this hierarchical structure. For example, very large blood vessels branching all the way down to capillaries. So can you just describe what is a biological network, and why is it important to understand scaling in these networks?
Yes. So biology is replete with networks. In fact, from this viewpoint, it's all networks to some varying degree, including, of course, one's neural system. I mean, obviously, we call them neural networks after all. And by the way, what makes that so difficult, dealing with neural networks, is, and one thing that I believe is often not included, is that makes, or understanding the brain so difficult, maybe that's what I should say, is that it's two networks. It's the neural network, the neurons, axons, and so on. But of course, that's integrated and interfaces with, and indeed we could even argue there's a tension between that network and the circulatory system that's keeping it going, that's supplying all the energy. So one network transmits information via electromagnetic signals. The other transmits energy via the flow of blood, and there has to be a transmission between them and integration. And so that's an extremely challenging problem to understand mathematically, but it's very typical. Both of those networks are very typical of biological networks at all scales, and we see biological networks. Well, the one we've talked about already, the circulatory system, is the obvious one, the one we're mostly familiar with, but there are these other, the respiratory system, others in the renal system, as I mentioned. But they typically are, as I said earlier, ones that have a kind of hierarchy in them. But also one of the things that they have that came out of the mathematics that I talked about in terms of the stuff that I did in understanding these networks is that they have a fractal-like self-similar structure. And I'll talk about that again in a second, but the way that comes out of the theory is a huge assumption that was made in the derivation, and that is that these networks optimize something. And that's where natural selection enters this problem. That is, it is the continuous feedback that has taken place via the process of natural selection, evolution and natural selection, has led to organisms approximating being optimal. And let me give you an example of that in terms of the network. So the statement would be that the circulatory system that we share, not just you and me, Andrew, but every human being on the planet, every human being that's ever existed, but not only that, every mammal that has ever existed, we all share the same cardiovascular system to, approximately, very closely we do. The one that has evolved that we all share is the one that minimizes the amount of work our heart has to do to pump blood through that system to support cells by supplying them with oxygen and nutrients. That's the idea. And why is that? It's because, now relating it to Darwinian fitness, that you want to minimize the amount of energy you allocate to the mundane process of staying alive and getting food and so on. You want to minimize that so you can maximize the amount of energy you devote to reproduction, to sex and reproduction and the rearing of your offspring in order to promote your genes. So that's the idea. That was sort of the trying to relate this to traditional evolutionary biology concepts. And so the idea is that all these networks approximate some kind of optimization. And that was crucial in the calculation and the derivation of this 3/4 power law. That's the thing that came out of the calculation, was that slope that I mentioned earlier on for metabolic rate is 3/4. That comes out of this calculation. And a crucial element of it is that this network is minimizing the amount of energy that you need to use in order to keep yourself alive. And one thing I didn't emphasize in that is that all the subsequent power laws to do with all these myriad other physiological variables and life history events are all dominated by slopes on that, plotting them logarithmically, that are simple powers of 1/4. That 1/4 comes out now. So the number 4 dominates everything around you. By the way, the brain, the white matter to gray matter scales as 5/4, for example, and so on. So it pops up everywhere, and it's all related to these network properties. And the 4, so 4 is the sort of the magic number of life, basically. So where does that come from? And so you go back through your calculations, by the way, these are quite complicated calculations. Took a long time to get it all straight. So you have to wade through and say, where the hell did that, why did it turn out to be 4 from the calculation? And you sort of, eventually, it's easy to figure out. It's 2 things. One is, one of the other properties of these networks, of all these networks, is mathematically called space filling. They have to go everywhere. Every cell in the body has to be supported by, the network has to end near every cell, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't get supported, and so on. So that's called space filling. So it has to fill the whole space, which we call the organism. The part of the 4 is 3, which is the dimensionality of the space in which you live, which is 3 dimensions. We live in 3 dimensions. So had we lived in 7 dimensions, the 3 would have been replaced by 7. And the +1 comes from the optimality. Now that's a little more, if anyone knows about fractals, one would know this, but when you have a fractal, so what is a fractal? Everybody's familiar with a fractal in terms of trees or broccoli. Broccoli is the great example. You take a piece of a big head of broccoli and you break off one of those little, whatever they're called, those little ends.
Broccolettes. No, I don't know.
Whatever they are. Florets, maybe they're called. You break off one of those pieces, and even little kids realize, oh, it looks like a little piece of broccoli. And of course, people have done this. If you you can do this yourself. You can take a photograph with your iPhone of that little piece, and you can blow it up, and it looks like just like the original piece of broccoli. So it's just a scaled down version. So the thing sort of reproduces itself. And biological networks primarily are self-similar. That's the phrase we use. They reproduce themselves. So if you look at a tree and you cut off a branch somewhere and you take it away from the tree, and you stick it in the ground, it looks like a little tree. And it is, in fact. And so, and that's true of your inside you. That's true of the networks inside you. They all have approximately this kind of structure, this kind of self-similar structure, and that's called a fractal. And one of the things we know about fractals is, one of the curious things is that they expand the idea of dimension. You know, we have this idea that we have, you know, one dimension is a line, two dimensions is like a square, a surface, three dimensions of volume, and so on. And four dimensions, well, maybe that's time, and so on. But one of the things about fractals is that if you take the mathematical definition of what I just said about one dimension, two dimension, three dimension, you put that into symbols, you realize that you can extend the idea to a fractional dimension. That is, could you imagine something with a dimension of 2.3, something between a surface and a volume? Well, it turns out mathematically, these fractal objects behave like that, behave as if they have this non-integer dimension. And that was discovered in the 60s by a man named Mandelbrot. And so that's become very big. It permeates nature, in fact. It was something that it's one of the mysteries of science, why it took till 1960 for natural scientists to realize this. I mean, it could have been discovered in the 17th century, actually. It wasn't. That is, and in fact, the interesting thing is that life, organic life, and social life are completely dominated by fractal-like structures. Life sort of took advantage of this other kind of geometry with this rather obscure idea of a fractional dimension to optimize the system. And that's what I'm getting to, is that if you want to truly optimize the system, you make a fractal out of it. And the most optimal is that you increase its dimension, its sort of naive dimension by a unit. So you can make something that is three-dimensional appear as if it's four-dimensional. Or I'll give you an example. I don't know if we want to dwell on this, but it is an important point. So, you know, if you think of a sheet, just a regular sheet, you think of those two-dimensional, right? I mean, it's just a sheet on your bed. It's two-dimensional. But now think of doing the following exercise. You want to wash those sheets. So you're going to wash them. So you also want to be very efficient. So you take all the sheets in the house, all the beds in the house, and you stuff them into your washing machine, which is a three-dimensional object. Okay, so you stuff them in. And then if you're a physicist, you think, what would happen if I doubled the size of my washing machine? How many more sheets would I get? Well, if you double the size of a sheet, of course, it goes up by a factor of 4, 2 times 2. So you would think, but if you double the volume, it goes up by a factor of 2 times 2 times 2, 8, 2 cubed. Now, if you ask how much more sheet, if I double the size of everything, goes into the washing machine, if you thought totally naively, you say, well, they're sheets, they're two-dimensional, so it's just 4 times. But of course, you're stuffing them in, and it's the volume you're filling. So actually, you get 8 times as much sheet that is going in there, because you're crinkling it up and you're making something that is still connected as two-dimensional. You're crinkling it up so that it behaves like a three-dimensional object. Or another example is, people don't do this anymore. People don't knit. My mum used to knit all the time, so I used to have balls of wool around, and she would, you know, you buy the wool and then you put it into a ball. Okay, but you know, the fiber, the wool, is one-dimensional. But when you make it into a ball, it's become a three-dimensional object. So if you double the size of the ball, okay, you don't double the length of the string of the yarn, you actually increase it by a factor of 8, because you've now made the yarn into something that's three-dimensional. And that's what you do inside you. That's how you've evolved. Our networks do that for us. It's
Wow.
beautiful. It's beautiful. God in his heaven designed it all right. It's very clever. Whoever designed it, of course, who designed it was natural selection trying to optimize.
Right.
And they optimize because they want to optimize to fit inside you. The statement, I forget, I said in the book, what is it? If you take your cardiovascular system and you lay all the vessels into the end, it goes around the earth at least once. I've forgotten the numbers. And your lungs are the size of a football field or whatever. That's because of the fractality you've sort of put it. It's extraordinary. And concomitant with that, you increase the dimensionality. So that takes the 3 dimensions to 4, and that's where the 4 comes in. That's why life is dominated by this number 4 in terms of the way it scales.
Right. So just to recap that, I mean, what you're saying is these 3-dimensional networks are behaving as if they have 4 dimensions. Is
Correct.
That right? Okay.
Correct. Exactly.
And that's due to this this space filling and I can't remember the term, but the crinkliness of the.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Very, very interesting.
So
Yes.
It's wonderful, actually. And by the way, you also asked, when you asked about that, why is it important? It's because life, as it evolves and as natural selection explores new niches and external conditions are continually changing and organisms are adapting, is you need to scale. You need to be continuously scaling, and you're always under competition. And the survival of the fittest kind of idea pushes you towards trying to optimize to gain on whoever's you're competing with. So that's the idea. And that's what's led to the discovery of fractals by life. It not only discovered, in its primitive form, it not only discovered the wonders of RNA and the wonders of a genetic code, but it discovered the wonders of fractals. Wow. And it pisses me off that people don't realize that more. That it's an equally profound discovery as the discovery of the code, because the code itself, I mean, it was wonderful to hear last week that yes, we now know the entire genetic code for the human being. Well, unlike what was touted 20 years ago, that only gets you so far. It doesn't, I mean, let's face it, the number of diseases that we have solved since then is minuscule compared to the promises that were made. I hate to be so, I'm being purposely provocative here because it's fantastic what has been done. I mean, it's wonderful. But, there's this other side. There's this other side to life that is the side actually we're much more conscious of, and that is its energetics, its metabolism, and that invokes its much more its physicality, and its physicality invokes this extraordinary discovery, so to speak, of the power of becoming fractal.
Right, right.
And thereby and optimizing.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that lays a nice groundwork for moving into metabolism, growth, aging. Yeah. So maybe we should think about growth for a minute.
Yes.
So perhaps a good question to get us going is, why, you mentioned this earlier, why do we eventually stop growing? Yes. At some point in our teenage years, we basically stop growing, and nobody really thinks of that as weird. But as you pointed out, I mean, why don't we just keep getting bigger and bigger throughout life?
Like by the way, cities do, economies do. And in fact, the whole paradigm of our modern economy since, the Industrial Revolution, the discovery and exploitation of fossil fuels and the invention of capitalism, that's what we do. We just keep doing more. And if the growth rate this year was 1%, even President Trump would be in trouble if he were president, because you got to be growing faster and faster. But we don't, and no one seems to care. In fact, not only don't seem to care, we enjoy it. That's who we are. So why is that? And so I want to go back to what I said earlier. So this theory, this derivation, this network theory was designed originally to understand metabolic rate, or at least the scaling of metabolic rate and so on. But once you have it and you realize that networks are fundamental to life, you can start asking questions about many, many other things because you have a theory and you just start using it. And indeed, one of the first things that we did was look at this very question you asked, growth. And so the idea was quite simple and conceptually. That is, you eat, you metabolize the food goes through networks to feed cells, and at the cellular level, it gets allocated on the one hand to maintenance of the cell, repairs damage, replaces ones that have died, and then it adds biomass by creating new cells. And that's sort of the process that certainly happens in ontogeny. And so how does that work? And then why does it stop? So you have to write that down. So what is the input to the system, the supply side? The supply side is metabolic rate. But metabolic rate goes as, has this increase with this 3/4 power, is the way we said in mathematics. Now, one thing I didn't emphasize is that it's less than linear. Because at the most naive level, if you didn't know about natural selection, you didn't know about anything and so on, and you just asked my mother, who's dead, but if you asked her, if I double the size of an organism, how much more food, how much bigger would the metabolic rate be? And she would likely have answered, well, you've doubled the size, so there's twice as many cells to feed, so you need twice as much. So you go linearly. That's what you would, the most naive level, without. It isn't that. If you double the size, what this 3/4 law says very approximately is that you don't need twice as much. You only need 75% as much every time you double, whether you go from 1 gram to 2 grams or a kilogram to 2 kilograms, anywhere along the line, you always have the same 75%. Well, that's interesting because it says the bigger you are, the more efficient you are, because it also says that per cell or per gram of tissue, you only need 75% of what you did when you were half the size. So, you are much more efficient than your dog or cat, but your horse is more efficient than you in terms of energy needed per cell. So that's very profound. And it's very profound here for growth, because as you grow, the supply is only increasing in what we call sublinear fashion. 3/4 is less than we call that sublinear. So the supply per cell is decreasing the bigger you are. On the other hand, you're adding cells at a kind of linear rate. So eventually, something that's increasing sublinearly can't keep up with something that's increasing linearly, and you automatically stop. So you have to put that into the equations with the networks and so on. And when you do it, beautiful, you derive what's called a sigmoidal curve. That is, you grow quickly at the beginning, and then it inevitably turns over and asymptotes to something constant, to some stable configuration, because the supply can no longer keep up with demand, and it stops at that point, and you just stay in a sort of metastable configuration, which is your adult mass, your adult weight. And so you can calculate that, and it's incredibly successful. I mean, if you look at the paper in Nature that we wrote that in, you can see we did it for a myriad number of organisms, and you can predict how big they're going to be and show that. And in fact, what is wonderful about that is that the parameters that control the growth curve are sort of, again, on the average universal parameters, because they're things like the average mass of a cell, the average energy needed to create a cell. These are kind of constant across, certainly across all mammals or across all birds, but they're almost constant across many macroscopic organisms. And so there's only 2 or 3 parameters that control the growth of all organisms. So that means it was very, very, very satisfying. You could rescale the growth curve so that everybody lies on the same curve. So if you look through the right lens, you rescale everybody accordingly, everybody grows in the same rate, which was wonderful. And there we drew this curve with all the various animals on it, relying on the same curve. And the mathematical formula for that curve was predicted. So that was very nice. That was very powerful. And we took that one step further a little bit later by applying it to tumors, which was much more challenging because tumors feed off, that's a network growing on a network. You have a host network, which is you. And then unfortunately, you have this thing, this tumor growing on you, which is still you, of course, so it has very similar parameters. And so it's complicated, the mathematics, but we did it. And from that, we derived the growth curves of solid tumors, metabolic rates, and so on and so forth. And one of the things, and it was great, it was very successful, it agreed very well with the data. And the only difference, and in fact, it even lies on the universal curve of growth. That is kind of, wow. Not surprisingly, because it's us. I mean, it's the same tissue, basically. The only difference, the major difference of tumors from healthy tissue is there's much more variance. It allows much more variance in the parameters and so on. It deviates, the deviations are bigger. But otherwise, it's pretty much, so I was actually quite disappointed to discover that the oncology community, like some biologists, doesn't care about theory. I was invited to I've been to many cancer meetings, and people have been extremely responsive, and I got good feedback, but they're not interested in theory, in this kind of in theory. And I feel that so my view, and I'm going to make an extremely provocative remark, this is like deciding we want to build an iPhone, but I know nothing about electromagnetism. I know nothing about materials. I don't know any theory of this, but I'm sure we can build one because it's such a wonderful idea. That's how I feel, to some extent, we're attacking the problem of cancer.
Wow.
That there isn't enough conceptual thinking and bigger picture thinking. And I was disappointed that here we have a theory that tells you something. I mean, the structure of the network of these tumors, that is its physiology, its metabolic rate, how it changes with size, its growth rate, its growth curve. But there was very little response. So that was disappointing. But anyway, that's a side comment. It's a total tangential comment. I was extremely pleased with the papers because it's nice to make a derivation and find the data and find that it agrees with data, makes predictions and so forth. But anyway, I don't want to dwell on that. I want to go back to the growth. We have the growth, and that was great because you also asked me about age, the thing I started with, which was aging and death. And so that works in a very interesting way. And it goes back to the same, it's so interesting. It goes back to the same origins as growth, namely, as to why we stop growing, namely that the metabolic rate of a cell in vivo decreases systematically with the size of the organism in which it sits. Okay, that's it. So you need systematically, according to this quarter pound scaling law, need systematically less energy the bigger you are. Now, so think of a cell, it's metabolizing, it's doing its thing, producing ATP and all the rest of it. It's working. And I said the most fundamental law of science is the second law of thermodynamics, namely, it's doing all these wonderful things, but it's therefore creating damage. It's creating it physically. I mean, the whole process of metabolism is, I mean, it's at the cellular level, it's creating damage because things are moving and bumping into each other, so to speak. But it's also producing the classic oxygen radicals. So it's producing kind of chemical damage, potentially. But equally importantly, it's being that energy that it's producing, the ATP effectively, is being transmitted through your circulatory system by the blood. And that's wearing out the system. I mean, it's causing damage in the same way that, pipes in this house are wearing and tearing, and, it occasionally leads to a problem. So that's what's happening. And indeed, as I said earlier, you're also repairing. But going back to the damage, what you realize is if you're using less energy, the bigger you are, you're systematically creating less damage the bigger you are. Therefore, even though your overall metabolic rate is much higher, if you're an elephant relative to a mouse, much higher, the metabolic rate of your cells is much lower. That's what's amazing. Your metabolic rate of a cell of an elephant is much lower than that of a mouse, even though the total metabolic rate is much bigger, but therefore the amount of damage done by an elephant in an elephant cell is systematically, predictably, calculably less than that of a mouse. Therefore, the elephant is going to live systematically, predictably longer than a mouse. The bigger you are, the longer that you're going to live because less damage is being done. Period. Finished. And so you could calculate that. That's what that is. And the rate of aging concomitantly is much faster in a mouse than it is in a whale, for example. And by the way, that also potentially explains, going back to tumors and cancer, something that some of your listeners, and maybe you've heard of Peto's paradox in cancer. There was a famous, I guess he was British oncologist, I forget his first name, Peto, very well known, that made the observation that the statement that, listen, why is it that whales, and I think even elephants, get so few tumors? What's going on here? And mice get lots of them. And it raises the question, how are we looking at mice all the time when they get so many more tumors than we are? And why aren't we looking at whales, which gets almost none? Was sort of the implication. So it was a paradox called Peto's paradox. Well, this gives at a minimum a hint. In fact, I believe gives an explanation for Peto's paradox as to why that is the case. Because tumors are a result of damage. And many tumors are a result of damage that we do to ourselves. I mean, that is because of metabolism. Metabolism causes damage. And so, the bigger you are, the less damage you're doing at the cellular level. Therefore, you're going to have less tumors. And a mouse is going to have lots and lots of tumors because their metabolic rate of the cell is so much higher. So it's going to create more damage, more tumors. And that's the answer for Peto's paradox. So it's related to the question of lifespan, that lifespan is extended the bigger you are. In the same way, you have less tumors, less damage, therefore you live longer. And I'll finish off this little bit with one other connection, one other thing we've worked on, and that is sleep. Because one of the other questions, that there's a lot of work on sleep, but remarkably, just like in aging, I don't think anywhere in the literature, in the voluminous literature on sleep, do people ask within a scientific paper, why do we sleep 8 hours a night?
Yes.
Why not, 2? or why not 20? What the hell? Why 8? Well, I used to think, and I used to read sometimes, well, it's because the night is roughly 8 hours long, which is very simplistic, which is sort of, but there are parts of the world where it isn't 8 hours long.
Right. Doesn't answer why other animals don't sleep that long either.
And then more importantly, much more importantly, that most people don't know, is that mice sleep 15 or 16, even as much as 18 hours a day.
Very intermittently.
Intermittently, of course. But if you add it all up, they need about 16 to 18 hours. And an elephant only needs 3 or 4. And a whale only about 2. So that's pretty amazing. So where in the hell does that come? Why? In fact, it's sort of an interesting question. What the hell does an elephant do with the other 20 odd hours that he's awake in the middle of and all those hours in the middle of the night? I don't know what the hell they do. But anyway, the interesting thing is, where does that? So we work. So this is very easily explained in this theory. I mean, you have to do all the calculations, but the idea is easy, because if you think of sleep as a repair mechanism, so why do we need to sleep? So that's the first thing. So you have to hypothesize, where does sleep come from? Well, we hypothesize that it comes because you need to repair. But, most of the body, we're sitting here talking like this, you're repairing your liver and you're replacing your skin and so on. You don't have to, it doesn't affect you. You just do it and so on. But there's one organ that you can't repair faithfully and easily without shutting the system down, and that's the brain. So, if you're going to repair, downtown Manhattan, all the roads and the system, you don't want to do it at, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You want to do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. So you need some analog to that, and that's called sleep. So that was the idea, that the hypothesis was that you need to have a downtime in order to repair the brain, because you couldn't function if you were doing all these repairs and reorganization, not just repairs, reorganization of the brain, all the trimming and the pruning and all the rest of the stuff that has to go on. If you are operational. So you need to have a time when you put that aside. And so the idea was, the simple idea was that the damage that you do during the day, which we can calculate, we have a theory, all that damage from metabolism that you're doing during the day has to be compensated for by the amount of metabolic energy you give to repair to take place during this downtime.
Wow.
So you have an equation. On the one side, it's proportional to the awake time, on one side of the equation. On the other, it's proportional to the sleep time. So this theory will predict the ratio of sleep time to awake time. And it does. And it predicts it. And it predicts, not surprisingly, that the bigger you are, since you're doing less damage, again, you're going to sleep. You need less sleep. So that's why an elephant only needs to sleep 3 or 4 hours. You need to sleep 7 or 8. And this poor little mouse has to sleep for 17 or whatever it is. Probably has to sleep for 19. I don't know what the number is. And that's it. So we've worked all that out. And I don't want to go into the details of that, but you have to work that out. But it's very nice. But this goes again to what I was saying earlier. It was not only when we derived that scaling law for metabolic rate, that there were lots of other scaling laws that followed from it. But there were things like this. The same theory gave rise to these growth curves across, the spectrum of life. And then we could explain aging and mortality. And then you could explain why the sleep and so on. So it's a kind of unified package. And that gives credence to the idea that sort of in approximately this theory in its sort of general conceptual framework is correct. That's what I would claim. There's no doubt lots of things that aren't right and myriad things that are incomplete. There's no question. There's so many loose ends and so many things. And in that sense, it's what we call a coarse grain theory. That is, it's for average quantities and so on. And one of the things, as you dig deeper into it, is to look at variances. And we've done a little bit of that. How much variance can you tolerate away from these scaling laws, and so on and so forth. But it is a kind of bigger picture unifying framework.
Yeah, absolutely. It is just a fascinating way of thinking about these systems, and it's something I'm sad to say that, like, in my 4 years as a molecular biology student, I did not run into many of these ideas, aside from just very briefly mentioning them in the one ecology class I took, which makes some sense there. But I know we're right up against our time. I wish I could just keep you here and keep questioning you. And these are just such fascinating ideas. And thank you so much for taking the time to explain them. And I want to just encourage everybody to check out this book. It's an awesome introduction to these ideas, and we didn't even cover a third of the content that is in the book. I mean, the just to give everyone an idea, the subtitle is "The Universal Laws of Life, Growth, and Death in Organisms, Cities, and Companies." So there's a lot more there. Again, I encourage people to check it out, and thank you again, Geoffrey.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Thank you for the conversation, the questions, and discussion. And thank you for promoting my book there.
Of course.
So I'm happy to follow up at any stage, by the way.
All right. Well, I'd love to do this again if you have some time.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll talk to you sometime soon then, hopefully.
Stay in touch, as they say. Thank you very much. Take good care. Bye.
You too.
Bye.
All right. Well, that is it. Thank you so much for listening to or watching this episode of the Thinking Tools podcast from Sense of Mind. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as the podcast. Also, consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use, and maybe even throw in a written review. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.